Jai Gurudev.
So we'd like to do questions with the student and teacher relationship. And the first question is, in our culture, many seekers are resistant to the idea of fully committing to a spiritual teacher and what that entails. However, you emphasize that the teacher is a principle, and many devoted students confirm that experience. Where does a student draw the line between relating to you as a person or as that guru principle?
In a way, that line, or where one can draw that line, where one is meant to draw that line, represents the whole gamut of that, if you will, creative tension between that, what is experienced in this, or on that phenomenal plane of reality, that what we speak of when we speak of our individuality, and how that unique individuality coexists with that what is the unified field, where simply unique individuality has the possibility of that very, very visceral, direct experience of that uniqueness, which simply contained within the field, with that unified field. So, the teacher-student relationship here falls into precisely that dynamic interplay represented by the unified field versus my individual existence, your individual existence. In other words, it's that tension, creative tension, between the absolute and the relative, between that which never came and will never go anywhere, that which is eternal by its very definition, and that which is ephemeral, that which is beyond any form, and that which is embodied in a specific form. So in a way, the guru principle versus individuality coexist simultaneously in exactly the same way as everything absolutely under the sun, as it were. Because that cannot be otherwise. It cannot be applicable only to some kind of sphere, philosophical or metaphysical sphere, esoteric sphere, and then a different affair unfolds or taking place in a day-to-day existence. Then it will not reflect in true measure what this relationship and what this dynamic tension represents. So, but how can that be brought into the plane of one's awareness, and how can that be made useful, or in other words, how can one can make something out of it in terms of where to draw the line? That is not as easy as it may sound, because this is where we're entering this field of direct experience. We're entering the field of how each and every one of us experiencing this dynamic relationship at any given moment in time. In other words, there is no such way as to draw the line and to say, so the day job, you come to the retreat, or you come to the class, you come into the session, you come in contact with the teacher, and you are in the presence of that universal principle. And then you step out of it and you are in the presence of a human being, you're in the presence of that individuality, which no doubt that whoever is being placed in the role of the teacher represents. You see? So this dynamic opens up, reveals, conceals itself at any time. What makes it interesting and what makes it poignant truly is when and how we are capable of drawing on these experiences which contribute to our unfoldment. It's as simple as that. In other words, if we are aware somehow, if we are tuned that there is indeed this dynamic relationship that simultaneously being coexistent in so and so. There is this absolute, there is this principle, and then that principle also expresses itself in a particular individual, him, her, and in a way this is where the whole zest of it, if you will, that's where the beauty of it, that's where the messy side of it as well. So hopefully in further dialogue, we will have the chance to touch upon this a little bit more.
So would you say that your action and speech is always coming from the Guru principle, or are there times when you don't act from that principle?
I'm being put on a spot. Well, it's a tricky one. It's a truly tricky one. Well, let's try to look at it with as much sincerity and integrity as we can. Well, you see that, again, if we are assigned to that whoever is being placed in the role of a teacher, if we assign to that being only a role of that absolute principle, then of course we're running the danger that that cannot do wrong. In other words, if that principle somehow fails, then who should say that that principle would not fail when a valid instruction would need to be given? Who would then be there to distinguish where the instruction and the teaching unfolded in the precise manner where it delivers the student, the one who is in need, even if temporarily, with that, what that principle meant to represent. And if that's not the case, then of course, then we open up to the possibility that the teacher can be wrong, because simply because he is still in the body. He is also this unique expression, and being that unique expression obviously opens up the possibility for all sorts of errors. Now, how to make it into a practical relationship, or how can we make anything out of it? Because the whole question is directed to me personally. Am I always embodying that principle? In other words, can I err? Am I always impeccable? Of course, obviously, that answer to that question simply doesn't exist. I cannot say yes, and I cannot say no. No would be more appropriate because it's kind of like more humble, and that's what probably some of you would like to hear. But that would also be not true to full measure, because if that principle is indeed engaged fully, if that principle is there in the first place and active, then it's not even up to me when that principle is at work. It cannot be usurped by my own willpower. It cannot be subject to manipulation of my so-called individuality, because that will diminish and undermine the principle. You cannot put the ocean back into the teacup, you see. You can have a storm in a teacup, but you cannot put all the waters of creation back into the cup. However, in order to enjoy this existence, you have to have that cupful measure. So therefore, that what would be then a given experience of working with the teacher, being with the teacher, precisely measured in terms of what one can swallow, what one can actually quench at any given moment in time. So this is a somewhat lengthy, hopefully not too obscure response, but let's go from here.
So how does one become closer to a teacher? Is it enough to think of him or her as much as one can? Or what is the difference between creating a mood surrounding the teacher versus actually entering a deeper dimension in that relationship?
Well, I guess the simple answer to that this is applicable to any relationship. Why would that be different when it comes to true friendship? Why would that be different when it comes to true intimacy? So in a way, relationship with the teacher obviously undergoes these phases. It has these phases that are very well known, by the way, to those who have gone through these experiences. The phases where in the initial stages there were a lot of perhaps tiptoeing or moving forward, going backward. And again, that example, that analogy with any other sphere of relationship should always be brought to mind, because this relationship, although often spoken as having its unique and incomparable flavor, if it to truly work, would have to reflect the relationships we have with anyone. And we also know that the degree of being able to form a relationship with someone is very much based to the degree of how much we can surrender to that relationship itself. And that is true to friendship, that is true to the intimate relationship, that is true to any relationship we are speak of here. So why should the relationship with the teacher be exception?
So what does complete surrender to the teacher look like?
It looks like anything that one can measure through one's direct experience. The true surrender cannot be spoken of as some kind of absolute measure. We cannot have one size fit all here. Some beings are capable of a tremendous degree of surrender. And then again, when we speak of surrender, then depends what we bring to that term and what kind of cultural components are we coming from or operating here with. Some people are by nature, by birth, by their maybe upbringing, by their physiological and even emotional setup, are more devotional in nature, kind of more feeling drawn and driven, feeling oriented. Does that mean that they will be able to surrender to a deeper level than those who find connection with everything through discernment of the intellect? And more can be said also about what true surrender looks like. Is really up to what one has been able to master in terms of how much can one give oneself to anything. And that ability to give oneself to anything is then here, obviously, could be seen as a measure of how much can one surrender to the process itself. Because the teacher doesn't need surrender, or doesn't need to have that as a form of kind of submission, although traditionally speaking, especially if we come from more Oriental perspective, that submission here represents and often spoken of as a prerequisite without which there would still be energetic abstraction. There would still be a certain resistances that would not allow that flow of transmission fully to take place. We can of course go into more details of how it works in terms of the anatomy of that process. The pathways need to be cleared. We're speaking of the subtle pathways. These pathways, the psychosomatic relationship, would have to be brought to a place where there is this, the dams are open, there's a flow, interflow. And that cannot happen if there are still resistances. And these resistances, in turn, often come from that very personal repository of certain conditionings that keeps us preventing from surrendering to a fuller measure. And of course, given then the cultural climate, where that surrender is often seen as some kind of anachronism of the gone-by age, where we no longer need it because we live at the time of the freedom of expression, freedom of information, freedom of choice. So who cares about the surrender? Give me enlightenment and let's get on with it, you see? But surrender here is not spoken in terms of some kind of demand of an upmanship of one being over another, although perhaps sadly this sometimes manifests itself in a certain way, or a certain dynamics of power come into play. And we know a lot of examples when this relationship is being abused by both parties. But if we are to speak about it in terms of how this ideally functions, then it functions simply from the place where abstractions is removed. And the abstractions are here chiefly of that, of the nature of psychic impressions. As long as one has something to defend, as long as one has some kind of position to hold on to, then for that being, it will be that much more difficult to receive in full measure. And that is not just in spiritual teaching. Imagine imparting some profound subtleties of music, of musicianship, learning any craft, acting craft, any craft in martial arts, any craft in visual arts. It's the same thing. Why should that be different? If I to receive certain subtleties of certain artistry, then in order for that truly flow from the teacher to me as a disciple, there has to be an opening. The floodgates have to be opened so that there is a heart-to-heart connection where often very little need for words and very, very little need for lengthy explanations, because it happens beyond that level. So this is as much as where they draw the line of surrender.
So how far can a teacher who is giving full guidance to his students go in instructing them about aspects of their personal life?
It's a delicate question. delicate, because if it's misunderstood, then the responsibility is being placed there and then on the teacher, or on anyone who, in a situation like this, is being placed in a position where one is being either asked for some guidance or advice with regard to someone's private life, or where, because of the degree of that relationship, degree of that connection with the teacher, one would expect to receive that guidance from someone who is being placed in a role of a guide. But what this brings instead is the necessity for taking full responsibility for one's life to such degree that nothing can be then hung on that relationship, where unfortunately very often we have witnessed, we have seen that firsthand, and we have seen that in the examples of historical examples and what happens in nowadays, where people who are not psychologically fully mature, they find in the spiritual teachers, those mummies and daddies, that they expect certain kind of taking of responsibility for their lives. And maybe in some cultures and maybe in some circles this was acceptable, and if we are maybe go to the historical references, in certain times and in certain settings, this perhaps model was very much alive and needed. Let's say in the examples of the life in the ashrams, where those renunciates usually who would leave their households and would join these gatherings, to join these ashrams, this kind of self-created institutions which live at the periphery of the household life, they will inevitably find themselves in a position where they would be then parented by spiritual guides. So that guru principle and that guru person was very much the mother and the father. And we can see that also reflected through the cultural sentiment, especially again in the Orient, where that role was even exalted beyond these parental figures. So that whole responsibility would then be in the hands of the so-called gurus to not only guide aspirant towards the heights of the unfoldment, spiritual unfoldment, but would have to cover absolutely every sphere of their life. Well, in the case of renunciate, what sphere of their life? They renounce everything. So one can perhaps narrow it down. The area to guide them would be much narrower. But imagine now, if we transfer and translate the situation into a household setting, where student comes into the work with his or her relationships, likes, dislikes, love affairs, marriages, relationships with siblings, with parents, with their children, and so forth. Imagine if all these will be brought to the teacher in quest for some kind of suitable, let alone legitimate answer that would work. It will overwhelm anyone, anytime. So I think teachers kind of, even those who came from the Orient, when they began to teach in Western soil, they quickly realized that that model might no longer work. So they were looking for other possibilities and solutions where they can do their work without getting involved too much into the lives of their students.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we've all read autobiographies of spiritual aspirants who, in the past, had to spend time under the eye and guidance of their teachers
Exactly.
to bear real fruits. However, given our current global age and the way that spirituality is disseminated, this personal contact can be limited. How does one fully pursue this path under these conditions, and would progress be faster if we were able to spend more time with the teacher?
Mm. We have to work with what we have, and there's no really much to be gained from wishing how we would like it to be. In the setting of the ashram, that is a possibility. But many spiritual teachers began to create international movements, and the teaching schedule will be a traveling one, very often with basis in one part of the world where they would travel to another part of the world. And so how can that be physically possible for certain students to remain in the presence of the teacher at all times? It's absolutely physically impossible. We ourselves have had these examples where people approached us with these requests that they would love to spend very close, intimate time in exchange for some volunteer service and even helping us in our household. And we know very well that that very rarely works. In most cases it doesn't. So we need to adopt what is really suitable in our situation without lamenting that somehow the quality of the work is not the same. What I would like to draw the attention in responding to this inquiry, in responding to a question like such as this, is that there are no limitations in consciousness, because consciousness is non-local. There are no limitations in terms of how this work can be done either. And this is what makes it so exciting, that it has tremendous adaptability. The adaptability, above all else, comes from one's predisposition towards doing one's work. If one has a proper intent, and if one is willing to carry one's intent through naturally unfolding actions that this intent brings, then nothing can stop on the way of one's evolution. One can have encounter with the teacher and then go on one's own only to perfect this, what is being received. I will give you an opposite example of what is being presented here just now. There were plenty of examples when there were short encounters of some very gifted students in this case, who approached the teachers, received the teaching, received the initiation, only to go on their own and perform their work, perform their sadhana, only maybe to return at a later stage and a later date just to receive some confirmation, or just to be in the presence of the teacher to see how far they have traveled, how far they have progressed. But I don't believe that one should create a certain condition, or the gone by age was much better because there was a possibility for being in the presence of the teacher and live there, and we don't have this means that somehow we are in a disadvantaged setting. I don't think so. I think that the current age of this, what technology allows, actually somehow bridges this and makes it into some other possibilities which are perhaps less mythical when you will write your own autobiography. But hey, let's be practical about it.
Yeah, I guess that goes back to what you said about the psychological maturity of the seeker, and also one's capacity. So going back to that, the psychological maturity and the impact of that on for spiritual awakening. Can you speak more about that?
Well, in a way, this is a prerequisite. That psychological maturity is a very important factor. Maybe this is where the popularity of spiritual movements such as satsang movement, the Neo-Advaita, is because although it had this very noble undercurrent and maybe very noble idea behind it, that everyone essentially is capable of enlightenment, everyone is here to enjoy the fruits of one's being because that's already given. And therefore one is ready to hear this teaching and to enjoy the fruits of this realization right now and right here. However, this does not necessarily goes in agreement with how it has been seen in many spiritual traditions that withstood the test of time. Precisely because spiritual work requires psychological maturity, because the unfoldment of consciousness, the untangling of life force from this whole conglomerate of the notions and ideas that we have created about ourselves, which essentially keeps us prisoner to the particular conditioning, where awareness obviously is eclipsed. No, it's never eclipsed, but it is, from the temporal perspective, is not being experienced as such. So that to speak about that life as being consciousness bliss, as a given birthright of every human being, does not necessarily translate into a direct experience of every human being. But that unfoldment and that reaching of the fullest potential requires psychological maturity, because the work begins when that whole gamut is being, if you will, set free. When all this, what otherwise is being kept neatly under cover, neatly and compactly, without us being even aware that all these impositions were the very, very predicament of why we're not experiencing this freedom, this stillness, the beatitude, and so forth. When this is set free, or when that is being unfolded, the unfoldment of consciousness is accompanied by the expansion which brings about simultaneous purification of all these tendencies. Without having a proper, solid psychological ground, the tendencies very often can take an upper hand. And this is almost a classical example how awakenings go astray, because there is nothing yet to hold this. There is nothing yet to hold it in a way there is no ground beneath the feet. This is where the yamas and niyamas of yoga are spoken of as the prerequisite. There are certain aspects that are conducive for self-realization, and there are certain traits and certain conditionings that are not conducive. It's as simple as that. And that psychological maturity is precisely being able to face one's own muck. Is being able to face that what otherwise hits the fan. Is being able to face these limitations which are not always pretty. When we are faced and when we are in the midst of experience of bliss and beatitude, when we are totally in stillness, when we are transported into these realms of the witnessing, and that's fine. There's no need to talk about this because this is already there and there confirmed by the very nature of this, that all these experiences just give us that solid sense of yes, yes, yes. But when we are faced with the limitations, when we are faced with the ugly side, that terrifying side of ourselves, when we are faced with the shadowy nature of the psyche, the psychological maturity is what allows us to carry on through this process, irrespective of how intense it may be for a time being. And that can take sometimes longer than we would like it to be. So psychological maturity is a must. And this is why I said earlier that unfortunately this area has been often swept under the carpet and often not given a full measure of what it really represents, because that kind of novelly expressed notion that everyone is already enlightened, that all there is awareness, and awareness is the only background of any experience, that somehow makes someone feel better. Of course it does. Of course it's liberating to hear. But that's not what the self-realization is about. Self-realization is one way or the other, is a process of transformation. Without that transformation, all this will remain at the level of ideas. And these ideas will reformulate themselves constantly into ideologies. And we just find ourselves at some point liberated by newly found ideology, only sooner or later to realize that nothing qualitatively have shifted, nothing qualitatively have changed. So
absolutely. I mean, within the Sangha, we've noticed that some have had great breakthroughs after attending one immersion with you and have received your grace and guidance, then not returned to try and become a teacher in their own right and make it on their own, instead of working within the Sangha or on themselves more. Do you advise this?
Well, I don't advise that. I obviously would not advise that, but it's a tough reality of life. So, yes, I can express a certain degree of dissatisfaction when this happen. But I would like to clarify something here. I would like to maybe speak about it a little bit in a very direct and candid way. That what is the most disappointing is when witnessing someone's often quite visceral, if not profound, breakthrough. It's like witnessing a raw talent on a street. It's like that coach who sees that kid who can kick the ball in the most amazing way. It's like that music teacher who picks someone who has that perfect pitch and amazing ear for melody. It's like that artist who simply recognizes that raw gift, talent in someone. And obviously, one would, given this role again, would be willing, would be very happy to essentially contribute to that process, to be of as much use as possible, so that one can reach one's fullest potential there and then. But what we witness instead is that somehow there is this tendency to settle one way or the other for less, only because of these above mentioned tendencies that we still ride. And as we know, there are different degrees to the way this individuality unfolds and the way that egoic structure essentially reveals itself. There are many areas, many pockets and many crevices where it can hide, pocketing all experiences, pocketing all breakthroughs. This is where the work is the most, if you will, difficult and the most tricky, and requires that very, very timely and skillful tweaking, that just the right reminder at the right time can go a long way. But then we witness that someone going through the breakthrough and on riding the wave of that breakthrough, which is fabulous. Every breakthrough has a honeymoon, every awakening has a honeymoon, every immediate kind of, like whatever something changed in a major way in our life, we obviously are there to enjoy it. Nobody says that we shouldn't. But what we forget is that in that enjoyment, we often not seem to be noticing how that what in the first place was there, usurping our freedom, what in the first place was the cause of that contraction, gradually begins to rear its ugly head and reintroducing itself. But by then, the narrative already is being built. We are somehow too busy about how we want to capitalize on that breakthrough. So therefore, I'm quite, if you will, old-fashioned about, rushing to instruct others. One should steepen it as long and as much as one can, and then steep more in that. Steep more in that silence, steep more in that bliss, steep more in that detachment. And then again, ask yourself, is this really, really time to teach? Is this really time to go and begin to instruct and impart that wisdom? Even if it's very, very exciting and very, very somehow feels the right thing to do. Because when we are still a work in progress, soon as we place ourselves in a position of guiding others, there is always a danger that runs parallel with this enterprise, that we will be entering a certain contract, a contract which will require a compromise, which is in relation to our own unfoldment. Because work in progress requires to be in that molten state as long as one wish to remain, as long as one need to remain in that. You begin to create narrative, you start to put across yourself as someone, then that narrative takes you over. And in no time, the structure reconfirms itself. And that what's supposed to be expansion remains then a memory, and we begin to teach from that memory. And then we begin to memorize, and it's a sad act to witness. But again, this is a reality of life, so we cannot really lament about it too much. So we just we do our best to bring this to people's awareness, and if someone is smart enough, then of course they will recognize that. But we also have witnessed that people sometimes think that this is the way it is, and nothing can be said about it, really. Everyone has their own karma, so they are subject to this decision making. We create our own reality.
That's right. And on the flip side of that, we've had people that are interested in this work that have had experiences with teachers that have not been positive. And what would you say to those that find themselves fearful of opening up to a teacher again?
Mm. It's not an easy one, because I don't want to sound here as giving someone a formula of how to love, because this is really all boils down to the capacity to relate, and the capacity to relate is inseparable from the openness to love, and not as some kind of experience, but it's literally the capacity to be fully present to this existence. It's another, if you will, definition of what love is. And in drawing this parallel, to me it seems there is this connection between being, if you will, hurt by improper or by erroneous conduct when it comes to this connection, to this relationship. It's the same as in any intimate relationship when we were being hurt. And the stronger we are being hurt, the more contracted we seem to become. This often is spoken of. It's like before one can love again, one needs to be fully healed. In other words, the heart can open up again to that. And it's like that contraction almost spoken of as a legitimate contraction. So I've been hurt, therefore I don't want to open up to another possibility of being hurt again. But this is, you see, this is the worldly perspective, and I'm sure that if we look into this from what it really represents, then if we also apply a certain degree of a deeper understanding of what our job here, and our job here is to be open to that, what at times could be heart splitting experience of being opened. So in other words, it's like, if you will, the very job is to be open to anything that arises in a field of our awareness, which is every experience. And that, by definition, is our capacity and ability to love. So the relationship and the connection with the teacher, when spoken in terms of ability to relate, is not different. But again, as I said, it's I don't want to sound as if it's easier said than done. So if someone has been manipulated, if someone has been hurt by a relationship with another teacher, and they found it hard to form a new connection, a new relationship, then there is only time that can heal that very worldly folk wisdom. It's only time that can heal. And what can be said about it? You cannot force that connection, you cannot force that relationship, you cannot cajole someone, you cannot invite into that relationship. You can only be there for the one who has been hurt. So it's that capacity of the heart is immeasurable. The capacity of the heart for forgiveness, for openness, is immeasurable.
So how to contain more love in the heart if it cannot be forced? Like, if it's the highest and noblest answer to whatever situation which arises in life.
It's the same as how can one embody more awareness, how can one contain more love in the heart. There is no such thing as to answer that question. We can only approximate. There's no way to say how much, how can, and what can be done. Because it's always to the very capacity. To the very capacity which here, in this case, when spoken about love in terms of not as an emotion, not as some kind of overpowering sense of connection to another being, even. But if we are to speak of love in terms of what love truly represents, love represents here our natural state. It's the being. Being and love are synonymous. Just as the term God, self, absolute, beauty, all these are synonymous, different words for the same unspeakable reality, for the same reality which is beyond the capacity of speech to convey what it represents. So really there is no such way as how to embody more love. One can only embody as much love, one can only contain as much love as one is aware. Awareness here equals love. As much as love is there in terms of how it is spoken in our culture, in our day-to-day situations, is linked to the intimate feeling and relationship to another being, or to what we speak of as our occupations, our likes, because love is also obviously spoken in terms of our calling in life. Love in terms of love for something. What it really represents here, what it stands for, is for the ultimate intimacy with our own self. So the love here is contained only to the degree of how much we are true to ourselves.
That's wonderful. And I mean, what would you say to someone that wants to know themselves truly as they are, yet they feel that life feels so normal and nothing feels spiritual, and it creates doubt and confusion about whether they're supposed to be on this path or if they're fit for it?
Well, you probably have heard me giving this answer many times, but the world is as you see it. So one can use this as a koan. One can ponder on this. What does it represent? Because the world, or our perception of what we call the world, does not exist outside of the perceptual capacity. In other words, this is where the experiencer and the object of our experience are interlinked to such degree that there's no way to separate them. This is what one needs to delve into, to ponder on, to sit with. That subject and object, although seems so separate from a certain point of view, and from a certain level of experience. In fact, one and the same. There's nothing that we experience that is separate from the subject who is experiencing it. And this is the realization that we, therefore, create each and every experience. We literally make the world the way that world is being experienced by us. You can turn it around in various ways. You can turn it the way that you can, if you will, knock off yourself from that comfortable seat of constantly complaining about how there is this inadequacy in terms of what one's experience as opposed to what one wish or what one would like to experience. But this is where that quantum understanding is directly applicable to the work of a spiritual aspirant, is that there is no difference whatsoever between the experiencer and the object of experiencing. Everything is in the relationship. Everything is then, therefore, in that dynamic tension, in that creative tension. So sooner or later there has to be this realization which literally brings forth the understanding that unless something changes within my perceptual capacity, then the world will never change as an objective reality, because that objective reality does not exist outside of my subjectivity. The subjectivity of my experience does not exist separately from the object of my experience either. You see? So when that realization dawns, then that in turn brings tremendous responsibility for one's status in terms of how one wants to experience life. And of course, I can lean on what the role of the spiritual perceptor is to guide and to give the methodology. But the methodology is given. These questions come from people who have the methodology, are initiated. They're not novices, they're not people who just walk through the door. So sooner or later, one would be essentially left with one's own devices. You see? And when we realize that we are always left with our own devices, there's nothing else other than that, then life begins to unfold from there in that proactive, creative way. Before that, there will be a lot of tiptoeing and constantly being confronted against and up against one's limitations. There's constantly will be someone who will be placed in a position of responsibility for our misfortune and for the way life is not up to our standard or not up to our measurement of what we expect from life to be. You see? But this is again, that's what I call that inevitable realization. It's not a spiritual insight somehow. I'm not talking about beatitude of sudden breakthrough. It's that inevitable realization. It's that maturity. It's that growing up. It's that growing up. There are phases when we suddenly realize we're no longer teenager. And it's still a vulnerable state, but I am no longer teenager. I'm a young man. I ought to tend and take care of myself, let alone of others. And likewise, there are midlife crises. It's just this, again, simple realization, but in the context of spiritual practice, that the world is, as you see it, is meant to be sat with as a koan, until the breakthrough comes.
So what are the ways in which transmission of energy received through the teacher can be nurtured and sustained? Are there things that should be avoided so that not to dissipate the potency of the energy of transformation?
We don't want to go into the necessity for strict rules, because it can introduce a certain rigidity into this perspective, and that rigidity will, if not spontaneously met with the melting qualities of that what this contemplative path is opened to, then it could create a possibility for reinforcing certain tendencies in us, certain, if you will, attitudes that rigidity inevitably invokes, or often met with on the inside. The fine balance here, of course, is between what we have spoken earlier, recognizing when certain tendencies that we know intuitively that outlive themselves already, yet perhaps we do not yet have enough power to simply meet these tendencies and put a blind eye to these tendencies. So in other words, the subtle line here runs through being able to distinguish where to go with the flow of what unfolds in the process, and at the same time being vigilant enough to nip in the bud when certain tendencies begin to resurface, and we know that these tendencies outlived, therefore they are no longer useful for our evolution. They keep us in a loop. They keep us prisoners to habits, to certain essentially numbing experiences, and therefore they are spoken of as tendencies. What also very important to mention perhaps is the attitude in the contemplative traditions towards sadhana, especially in the phases when one is initiated or receives transmission, and one simply needs to be able to sit with it. That phase of sitting is very important. One needs to be grounded, steeped in that, and that being steeped can only come from discipline of commitment to that, whatever that methodology is based on. Very often we come across these attitudes of very playful attitudes that, meditation is washing the dishes, walking on the beach. Everything is meditation. In our day and age, meditation is given such wide perspectives and analogies that life is a meditation itself. When everything is on the floor, we call it a meditation. But there is also meditation. There is also sitting down, and that's what sadhana is. In contemplative spirituality, sitting down is a methodology, and sitting down is a must for grounding and for allowing the expansion of energy simultaneously. So this expansion and unfoldment and integration. They go hand in hand, and therefore these are indispensable aspects of one's sadhana. So, other than that, just be vigilant to what rises there, and soon as you find yourself in a loop, take yourself out of that loop. This is what I call nip it in the bud. And there is no need to make a big deal out of it. It's being able to recognize it for what it is and move on. No need to feel guilty, no need to crucify oneself for this. Just move on. It's as simple as that. There'll be ups and downs, there'll be peaks and valleys. Just move on. Don't settle on anything. That's the rule of thumb.
In non-duality, there's this notion that everything has the same value, so nothing's more or less. But where does this leave us when it comes to actions, to choose, and what is right and what is wrong?
Well, it squarely relates to what we have spoken earlier in terms of this prerequisite for psychological maturity. In a way, certain aspects of spiritual teachings are not revealed until there is a degree of reassurance that the one who partakes in the teaching can handle it. If someone who is emotionally, psychologically immature begins to hear that everything essentially are waters of oneness, and everything is the same waters of oneness, then this can only perpetuate the possibility of remaining in the status quo. That very flame, that very tapas, that very, very ardor, without which there is no transformation. And we can speak about it in greater detail, in greater terms, will be extinguished. And that very flame need to be nurtured, held, sustained, nourished through offering, nourished through precisely offering into that flame in a skillful way. But settling on the idea or the notion that there is no good and bad can only backfire, because if one is stuck in inertia, then there will be very little propensity to move beyond that inertia, because that inertia will be then justified by that mental dialogue that all this is oneness. And in that oneness, good or bad doesn't exist. Even though that polarity is a chief property of the mind itself. That polarity, indeed, is what renders everything asunder. That polarity what makes us prisoners of likes and dislikes, what keeps us going around the circles by pursuing something on the horizontal plane of existence at the expense of that inner freedom, still needs to be understood in terms of what is a real purpose of spiritual practice. And this is where not all, if you will, perspectives, not all spiritual perspectives agree upon squarely. There are differences in how it is being viewed, differences in how it is being approached. For example, Vedic spirituality, Vedic tradition, Vedic civilization rests upon the notion of sacrifice. It is inseparable from that notion of offering. And that offering is what sustains here everything. sustains equals here keeping things in balance. It is being brought to the level of the highest philosophy in Vedic culture. And Vedic culture, as we know, gave rise to various civilizations, Buddhist civilization and Hindu civilization, and all this is inseparable from that very, very idea of sacrifice, which in itself acts as that balancing act. Unless something is offered into something else, unless something is sacrificed into something else, there is no possibility to maintain the balance. So the very noble purpose of spirituality from this perspective is not so much give me back my freedom that I've lost. I want enlightenment or bust. I want to get realization because this is really my birthright. But it is also understood in terms of that greater cosmology, that everything is being maintained and sustained in such way that it is here within the human body the possibility of reconciliation can take place. And that reconciliation is not a trivial affair. That reconciliation here is really where this and that are being held at the tipping point of balance. This is where all the divine impulses, all the creative impulses of the divine intelligence find the expression and find the manifestation in and through this unique or uniquely perceived individual. Whereas in fact there's a cosmic affair going on. And it is that cosmic affair, that keeping things in balance, that is being considered the main purpose. In as far as, if we are to speak from that perspective, from that tradition.
Yeah, I mean, people might associate wrong and right action very much to do with karma as well.
Sure, well, the right and wrong, of course, is when we speak of the necessity for coexistence and acting at the respective planes of reality, and this is a respective plane of reality which we share. In this plane of reality, the laws that govern this plane of reality cannot be bypassed. So we already have to respect these laws. We can wish we bypass or transcend these laws or go beyond them, but these laws nevertheless are here. Fire is needed to cook food. Water is needed to wash something, or to quench the thirst. Gravity is here to hold things in place so that they don't float in space, and so forth. So the respective planes of reality have governing laws, and these governing laws also can be spoken of in terms of the, if you will, a certain required, agreed upon mode of conduct, code of conduct. So yes, there are spiritual teachings that disregard all this on the account of this being arbitrary, always being arbitrary. We don't dispute that. Of course it is. But we don't advocate chaos. In fact, the Vedic perspective that we speak of here, which obviously Tantra is inseparable from, and Tantra comes from Vedic culture, comes from Vedic civilization. The very purpose of these traditions is to maintain that balance, and that balance being maintained precisely by respecting every respective level of creation for what that level of creation represents, honoring and paying tribute to. So therefore, when we speak of good and bad here, although there's no way we can possibly with certainty declare that this is good or that is bad, because ultimately there is no way to tell how far these aforementioned strings and repercussions and frequencies of karmic actions and interactions go. We nevertheless have to respect these very, very fundamental qualities, the fundamental qualities of non-harming, the fundamental qualities of recognition that all and everyone would like to be treated in likewise manner, the fundamental qualities of peace, the fundamental qualities of love, the fundamental qualities of interconnectedness of all life. So there are certain things that whether we want to discard them because we are in a frenzy of some philosophical, metaphysical inspiration to transcend it all, we still have to land and walk on the ground. And as soon as we walk on the ground, we are immediately confronted with and met with the necessity to abide by these laws that govern this plane of reality. So better we speak and deal with it with our feet firmly on the ground.
And what of compassion? I know that in Buddhism it's very revered, but in Advaita Tantra and Kashmir Shaivism, what is its role, if there is one?
Yes, compassion is, Buddhism is very big on compassion, which is inseparable from that realization that one way or the other, everything is suffering. That sukha dukkha connection that is spoken of in Buddhism, that ultimately every experience, one way or the other, no matter how enjoyable, turns out to be suffering in as much and as long as there is this entanglement in the experience itself, and that entanglement in the experience brings this involvement in the so-called cycle of birth and death, which Buddhism is very big on, and all thoughts and all schools of Indian philosophy are kind of have the perspective on that. When we speak of Tantra, the term compassion may not be spoken or brought to such emphasis as it is in Buddhism, although there are different kinds of Buddhism, there are different types of Buddhism, obviously. There's a Tibetan Buddhism, and some of these forms of Buddhism are very tantric in their essence. But the compassion from tantric perspective here is not so much spoken in terms of these dynamics brought by that aforementioned term sukha and dukkha, that joy and suffering, but more from the perspective of what simply the quality of one's open heart. The compassion here, it's that fundamental quality of openness. It's fundamental quality of fullness. It's kind of more life-affirming. Not that Buddhism is not life-affirming, but there is this life-affirming attitude that Kashmir Shaivism is known for. Life-affirming attitude that all life is an expression of divine. All life is already perfect expression of the divine. And the compassion here is not so much have this religious undertone as, forgive me, to those listeners who may disagree with that, which Buddhism still carries. There's certain undertones that has that religious connotations that kind of like bring that slight sense, if you will, of that sense of guilt in. And from tantric perspective, specifically from the perspective of Kashmir Shaivism, the compassion is obviously the quality of the evolved being. It's a quality of the evolved and open heart. It's a byproduct. It's not something that one can cultivate, but it's simply a result of one's life lived in freedom, where one simply sees everything as the expression of oneself, and one desires that for any other creature. So these very, very tenets of what Hinduism is known for, these codes of Manu, the laws of Manu, the ahimsa, non-harming, and likewise translated and being respected in Kashmir Shaivism. So these are very, very foundational qualities.
And what is the right use of thought in spirituality? Is there a place for positive thinking or affirmation in Advaita Tantra?
Right, so positive thinking and affirmation. Positive thinking. I think the most important reminder here would be is that the first and the last step here in Tantric Shaivism is that absolutely everything is the expression of Shiva. Everything. And unlike some schools of Indian philosophy, like Samkhya, where the Godhead is uninvolved, standing in its eminence in total aloofness to creation, and there is no way to reconcile that. And from the perspective of Kashmir Shaivism, everything, absolutely everything under the sun is the expression of that Godhead. So that is the foundational understanding, that everything is already the luminosity of Shiva. Everything is illumined by the light of Shiva. Everything is illumined by the light of your own awareness, because Shiva stands for awareness. It stands for the power to be aware of oneself. Therefore, it's also the power of self-awareness. This is what really truly empowering. This is truly a positive affirmation, a monistic, a truly non-dual, a truly Advaita affirmation. When that precedes any other affirmation, then it knows no superior one, because everything, absolutely everything, is the expression of one's own self. And that expression is not some kind of abstract, aloof expression, but it is the creative expression of one's own power, unlimited power, to create, to sustain, and to dissolve. To conceal one's own nature from oneself and to reveal one's own nature as the playful sport. This is the truly empowering and truly liberating teaching. Whatever affirmation one can make from it, it's for them to do it.
Om Namah Shivaya.
Shivaya Namah Om.
Thank you.
Thank you.